My molecule of the day was MDMA, and in this presentation I will be sharing a bit about this molecule, including its effects on users, a brief history, and a basic mechanism of how it functions within neurons. MDMA is also known as ecstasy or Molly, those are its common names. It has some structural parts such as methyl, benzene ring, amine, and methylene dioxide group. A couple of positive short-term effects of MDMA include feelings of euphoria. It is a stimulant. It increases awareness, and for users, they have said that it causes a greater sense of spirituality. A couple of negative effects include short-term physical and cognitive problems, as well as long-term brain damage, and I will be touching upon that later. So here's a brief history of MDMA. In 1912, this molecule was first synthesized in Germany, and it's ironic because the intention was to synthesize a substance that would stop bleeding, and that is not its function by any means. In the 1950s, I thought this was interesting. The CIA conducted experiments with MDA for mind control. I don't think that worked out too well. In the 1980s, all the way to the present, MDA is well known for its recreational use. Starting in the 1980s, rave culture picked up on its use, and that's when it started to become more legally synthesized. And now, looking in the present, medical researchers are saying that there's a potential for MDMA to offer treatments for people who struggle with PTSD and depression. And as we can see, there's quite a disparity between the original intent of the drug and its current use. Let's look at the chemical mechanism of MDMA. On the right, we see a neuron that has not been affected by MDMA, and the mechanism of that neuron I'm going to describe right now. So when there is an action potential, the vesicles that contain a neurotransmitter such as serotonin are released down the axon terminal and are released at the bottom, with the neurotransmitters entering into the synaptic cleft to be bonded to receptors on neighboring neurons. Now, extraneous serotonin or neurotransmitters can be reuptaken through transport proteins that are specific to the neurotransmitter, so it can be reused, and it's quite a process that has to do a lot with homeostasis. Now, looking on the right, we see a neuron that has been affected by MDMA. Now, because MDMA has a very similar molecular structure as molecules such as serotonin, it can enter in through the transport protein that is specific to serotonin or neurotransmitters alike, and it can enter into the axon terminal. And once it enters into the axon terminal, it prevents vesicles from reuptaking neurotransmitters like serotonin. That's its primary, what it does first, and a secondary thing that it does is it causes the transport proteins to have the inverse effect on where it pumps the neurotransmitters. So for example, instead of the neurotransmitters being pumped from the synaptic cleft into the axon terminal, the neurotransmitters are being pumped solely from the axon terminal into the synaptic cleft. And this is where large feelings of euphoria are felt because of the large influx of neurotransmitters that can be bonded to receptors on neighboring neurons. All right, and looking at the negative consequences of MDMA, looking short term, we see some physiological issues that MDMA causes, which include elevated blood pressure, an increased heart rate, and increased body temperature. And looking at raves, back into the history and social use of MDMA, A lot of people have actually died by using MDMA in these environments because they're surrounded by people and they're taking a drug that takes them further away from homeostasis, and that has caused a lot of deaths. And based off of what we saw on the previous slide, there are feelings of depression following use because the neurotransmitters can only be released so much with the presence of MDMA until it runs out. And during the time that it runs out and needs to be built up over time, that's when feelings of depression can manifest. Looking long term, we see that depression is another ailment that can affect users, in that it causes continual use of MDMA causes the degradation of the transport proteins, which would reduce overall uptake of serotonin. And another long-term problem with taking MDMA is memory loss. In comparing the positives, the short-term positives of MDMA and the short-term and long-term consequences, I think it's quite obvious that it's probably not the best drug to turn to, and it should be treaded very carefully toward with potential treatments with people who struggle with depression and PTSD.